In the early 1900s, New York streets were ruled by scattered gangs, rival families, and unstable alliances, where power shifted with every deal and every gunshot. There was no central authority, no unified system, only competition and survival. Out of this disorder emerged a man who understood that control did not come from chaos, but from structure. Through calculated alliances, financial networks, and carefully planned eliminations, he reshaped criminal operations into a coordinated machine. His influence extended from street corners to courtrooms, from docks to boardrooms. This is the story of how fragmented crime became an organized empire, and how one strategist learned to rule it. In the early 20th century, New York City was a battleground. A city of stark contrasts, where towering skyscrapers rose above the gritty, chaotic streets. The underworld, like the streets, was fractured and brutal, a far cry from the well-organized, multimillion-dollar criminal enterprise it would become in the decades that followed. Crime was rampant, but there was no central figure, no one who truly held the reins. The mafia families were disjointed, each vying for control of their turf, but none held dominion over the entire operation. It was a volatile, often dangerous world, and into this chaos stepped one man who would redefine the very nature of organized crime in America. That man was Salvatore Lucania, better known to history as Lucky Luciano. Luciano's story is not merely one of ambition and ruthlessness. It is a tale of vision, manipulation, and a cold strategic brilliance that transformed him into the most influential mob boss in American history. His story is not just the rise of a criminal but the rise of a criminal empire, one that operated like a business, using fear, loyalty, and power as currency. His methods would forever alter the landscape of organized crime, turning it into a sophisticated, nationwide operation. But while his innovations and brilliance were undeniable, the path he took was steeped in betrayal, violence, and a ruthless pursuit of control. Before Luciano's ascension, the mafia was a fractured force. There were plenty of Italian-American families involved in organized crime, but they were scattered and often locked in fierce competition with one another. The old-world Sicilian traditions that ruled the underworld were in disarray. The code of silence, or omerta, was often more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. The bosses and their families operated with a sense of honor, but there were still deep fissures within the structure, rivalries, power plays, and shifting allegiances. It was a far cry from the united front Luciano would later create. The chaos that defined organized crime before Luciano's rise provided fertile ground for a new kind of leader, someone with the foresight to recognize that in order to gain real power, the fragmented groups had to be unified under one banner. Luciano was no street poet, no romanticized gangster with a heart of gold. He was a pragmatist, and he had one simple understanding. Power is not just about strength, it's about control. But control, in his mind, did not come through violence alone. To truly dominate, he would have to innovate. Lucky Luciano's genius lay in his ability to understand not just the operations of the criminal world but the psychology behind it. He was a man who knew the value of loyalty but also the leverage that betrayal could offer. Where other mob bosses operated with old-world sensibilities, Luciano saw a new world where the mafia could be as systematic as any Fortune 500 company. Crime could be run with precision, with a boardroom mentality at its heart. Each boss, each soldier, each associate could be a cog in a larger machine, working toward the same goal of domination. But he didn't start at the top. Born in 1897 in Sicily, Luciano was the son of poor immigrants who made their way to the United States in search of a better life. They settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a part of the city that was teeming with poverty, crime, and the raw, unrefined spirit of the immigrant experience. It was here that Luciano's formative years shaped his future. From an early age he was exposed to the underworld, becoming entangled in petty crime and street hustles. His early life was defined by survival, not idealism. He wasn't driven by a sense of justice or morality but by a desire to rise above his circumstances. His ambitions were not those of a simple thug, but those of someone who could see beyond the small-time schemes and wanted to play on a larger stage. As a teenager, Luciano's natural charisma and street smarts quickly attracted the attention of the local crime bosses. He became involved in a variety of criminal activities, from smuggling to extortion. But it wasn't just his capacity for violence or his ruthlessness that set him apart. It was his ability to think several steps ahead. Luciano understood that alliances were temporary and that the real key to power was manipulation. He learned quickly how to use people not just as tools for his schemes, but as leverage for his larger goals. By the time he was in his 20s, Luciano had already built a reputation as someone who could be trusted, at least for a time. His first major move came when he became involved with a young mobster named Meyer Lansky. The two would form one of the most powerful and enduring partnerships in mafia history. Where Luciano had a keen sense for power, Lansky was a financial genius. Lansky's ability to launder money and his deep knowledge of gambling operations allowed Luciano to branch out into more lucrative, organized forms of crime. Together, they began to restructure the way the mafia operated, turning street-level rackets into sophisticated, organized enterprises. At the heart of Luciano's rise was his vision for a unified mafia. He recognized that with the right alliances he could consolidate power across the nation. Unlike the traditional bosses who maintained control through intimidation and violence, Luciano used a more subtle weapon: fear. He understood that fear wasn't just about brute force. It was about creating an atmosphere where people obeyed not just because they feared retribution, but because they knew there was no alternative. It wasn't just about killing your enemies, it was about making sure they had no chance of challenging you. This was the essence of Luciano's strategy, a strategy of fear. He worked tirelessly to eliminate his rivals, not just physically, but by strategically dismantling their support structures. He played factions against each other, creating an environment where no one dared to challenge him. Those who were once competitors became subordinates. He was a master of psychological warfare, always staying one step ahead of those who thought they could take him down. His ability to anticipate moves, his understanding of human nature, and his relentless pursuit of power made him a terrifying figure in the underworld. But for all his brilliance, Luciano's rise was not without its cost. His own personal code was one of cold efficiency, and betrayal was just a tool to further his ambitions. The very tactics that allowed him to control the underworld would eventually be turned against him. Luciano was not just playing a game of power, he was playing a dangerous game of human psychology, where the stakes were life or death, and where even the most trusted allies could become potential threats. His empire, which he had built with such care and cunning, was also fragile, a network of deals and alliances that could easily collapse under the weight of its own complexity. Luciano's journey was not one of blind ambition or reckless violence, but of a careful, calculated climb to power. His rise was marked by an understanding of the world that few could match, a world where loyalty was only as strong as the last deal struck, and where fear was the glue that held the entire system together. It was a strategy that not only secured his dominance but would go on to define the very nature of the mafia itself. And yet, even as he reached the pinnacle of his power, Luciano knew that the game was never over. His story is one of constant reinvention and adaptation, a tale of a man who understood that in the world of crime, to remain on top, you had to constantly evolve, or fall. Before Lucky Luciano came to dominate the mafia, the world of organized crime in America was one of fractured chaos. The underworld was filled with powerful families, each claiming a piece of the pie. But there was no unity, no single figurehead capable of commanding the loyalty of every faction. Rivalries between these families were rampant, and violent turf wars were common. Each boss had his own way of operating, and while they might have shared a common goal, making money, they rarely worked together and certainly didn't trust one another. The idea of a unified crime syndicate was a distant dream, one that no one had the vision or the ambition to bring into reality. The early days of the mafia in America were shaped by old-world customs brought over by Sicilian immigrants. The concept of omerta, the code of silence, was central to the mafia's operations. It wasn't just a code of conduct, it was a way of life. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal could cost a man his life. But this sense of honor, though powerful, wasn't enough to bring order to the chaos. Families operated as independent units, each one fiercely protective of its turf, its wealth, and its position in the criminal hierarchy. This constant state of fragmentation kept the mafia from reaching its true potential. While individual families made fortunes in bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, there was no overarching structure to unify the criminal enterprises. The reality of life in the mafia was as brutal as it was unstructured. The world Luciano was born into was one where violence was the quickest route to power. As a young man, Luciano found himself immersed in this violent world, learning the harsh realities of street life. But what set him apart from others was his ability to see beyond the short-term gains of violence and intimidation. Luciano wasn't content to operate in the chaos, he wanted to control it. He saw that the fragmented nature of the mafia was both a weakness and an opportunity. Where others saw disarray, he saw a potential empire waiting to be built. But building such an empire would require more than just muscle. It would require strategy, foresight, and, most importantly, the ability to manipulate the rivalries and divisions within the mafia. At the heart of this chaotic world were the old Sicilian families who brought with them their own brand of brutality and tradition. They operated on a strict code, one that was steeped in secrecy and fear. The mafia's power in the early 1900s was based on family loyalty and street smarts, but these qualities often led to bitter infighting. Instead of forming lasting alliances, the various families were constantly at war with one another. Power was won and lost in the streets, where blood was spilled and alliances shifted with every new act of violence. The code of silence, though powerful, did little to prevent betrayal. In fact, it often made it easier for those who wished to rise to power to strike deals with one family while secretly plotting against another. It was this volatility that created the perfect environment for a man like Luciano to thrive. Luciano's ambition, however, was not to become just another boss in a fractured world. He wasn't interested in petty turf wars or small-time crime. What Luciano saw in the mafia was the potential for something greater, something far more organized and lucrative. He was a man who could look at the chaos of the underworld and imagine a new world order. In his mind, the mafia didn't need to be a collection of competing families, each operating independently. Instead, he envisioned a centralized structure, a system where all the families worked together under a unified leadership to achieve common goals. But to make that vision a reality, he would need to eliminate the power struggles, the distrust, and the constant infighting that characterized the mafia of the time. To accomplish this, Luciano had to be strategic. He couldn't simply force his way to the top. Violence alone would never bring about the kind of change he envisioned. He needed to build alliances with other powerful figures, form partnerships that would strengthen his position and give him the leverage he needed to restructure the mafia. Luciano's gift was his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and fears. He knew that loyalty could be bought, but it also had to be earned. And in a world where betrayal was commonplace, Luciano knew that the key to power was not only building trust but maintaining it. He played on the psychology of fear, ensuring that those who worked with him knew they had no choice but to remain loyal, because those who betrayed him would find themselves eliminated. The first step in Luciano's grand plan was to secure his own position within the existing power structure. He aligned himself with key figures, including Meyer Lansky, a brilliant financier who would later become Luciano's most trusted ally. Lansky brought with him the expertise in money laundering and the gambling rackets that would be crucial to Luciano's rise. Together they began to consolidate power. But Luciano's real genius lay in his ability to understand the mafia's greatest weakness, its lack of organization. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. He began to push for the creation of a more formal structure, one that could harness the power of all the families and turn it into a cohesive force. While others were focused on territorial expansion and simple criminal endeavors, Luciano began to think on a larger scale. He recognized that the mafia was not just a network of criminals, it was a potential business empire. To build this empire, however, he would need to bring together the disparate families under one banner. This was no easy task. The various mafia families, each with their own history and traditions, were fiercely independent. But Luciano knew that if he could manage to unite them, the power that could be harnessed would be unprecedented. He understood the importance of maintaining the loyalty of the family heads, but he also recognized that he could not do it alone. He needed to make alliances with men like Lansky, men who could bring different skills and resources to the table. By building a coalition of like-minded individuals, Luciano could begin to reshape the mafia from the ground up. The next step in Luciano's plan was the creation of the National Crime Syndicate, an unprecedented move in the history of American organized crime. This was Luciano's vision for a unified, nationwide crime organization, one that would oversee all mafia operations and eliminate the infighting that had defined the underworld for so long. To make this vision a reality, Luciano had to negotiate with other powerful figures in the mafia, including the leaders of the Genovese, Gambino, and other families. It wasn't just about power, it was about control over the vast web of criminal enterprises that stretched across the country. Luciano understood that to dominate, he had to be the one to call the shots. He wasn't just a boss in New York, he wanted to be the boss of the entire mafia. Luciano's creation of the National Crime Syndicate was a game-changer. It allowed him to consolidate power and eliminate much of the chaos that had plagued the mafia for decades. With the syndicate in place, Luciano could direct the various families and criminal operations as one unified force. But this was also a risky move. It made Luciano a target. In order to maintain control over the syndicate, he had to constantly balance loyalty with fear, building a web of alliances while keeping rivals at bay. As much as he sought unity, the mafia was still a world of betrayal and violence, and Luciano had to navigate these dangers with precision. But what Luciano had created was something unprecedented. A new order in the world of crime, one where power was centralized and loyalty was both a weapon and a shield. He had taken the fractured, chaotic world of the mafia and turned it into a well-oiled machine, where fear and loyalty were two sides of the same coin. It wasn't just about who had the most men or the most money, it was about who had the power to make the system work in their favor. And Luciano had proven that he could do just that. By uniting the families, he had transformed the mafia from a fractured collection of rival organizations into an unstoppable force, one that would dominate the criminal world for decades to come. Luciano's rise from a street kid to the most powerful mobster in America was anything but ordinary. He was not born into wealth or privilege but into a world that offered little more than a harsh struggle for survival. His family, like so many other Italian immigrants, had come to America with the hopes of a better life but quickly found themselves trapped in the gritty underbelly of New York City's Lower East Side. It was here, amidst the poverty and crime, that Luciano's destiny began to take shape. The tough streets of Manhattan became his training ground, and the city's criminal underworld, his classroom. From a young age, Luciano had to navigate a world where the weak were preyed upon and the strong ruled. Growing up in a neighborhood dominated by gangs and petty crime, he learned quickly that life was about more than just survival, it was about power. As a teenager, he was introduced to a world that operated by a set of unspoken rules, where loyalty was demanded, and betrayal was punished with swift, brutal retribution. His early experiences with crime weren't glamorous or heroic. There were no big scores or glamorous heists. Instead, they were small-time jobs, the kinds of petty hustles that allowed him to make a living while learning the ropes of the underworld. But even in these early years, Luciano exhibited a keen mind for strategy and a ruthless ambition that set him apart from his peers. He wasn't content to simply participate in the street-level games of crime. He wanted more. He understood that real power didn't come from being the strongest or the most ruthless. It came from being the smartest. It was this mindset that would eventually propel him to the top of the mafia world. Unlike many of the other gangsters in his neighborhood, Luciano didn't want to just be another tough guy. He wasn't interested in simply making a name for himself by engaging in petty criminal activities or trying to carve out a small piece of turf. His vision extended far beyond the narrow confines of street-level crime. He wanted to control it all. And to do that, he needed to think on a larger scale. Luciano's rise to prominence was marked by his ability to seize opportunities that others either ignored or didn't recognize. It wasn't enough to hustle on the street corners. He saw potential in organizing crime and making it a business, a far cry from the chaotic, fragmented operation that existed at the time. Where other mobsters saw crime as a series of individual, disjointed rackets, Luciano saw the potential to unify and streamline operations, turning them into a coordinated, money-making machine. His ambition wasn't limited to making money, it was about creating a criminal empire, something that could rival legitimate businesses in terms of scale and profitability. To achieve this, Luciano knew he needed to build a network of reliable, skilled partners who could help him execute his vision. It wasn't just about violence and intimidation, it was about forming alliances and building a base of loyal, competent individuals who could manage the various facets of his operation. He understood that in order to control the vast network of illegal activities that he envisioned, he would need the skills and resources of men who were experts in their fields. At the time, Luciano was still a relatively small player in the larger world of organized crime. He was making a name for himself in the streets, running small-time rackets and establishing connections with influential figures within the underworld. But he knew that in order to rise to the top, he would need to form alliances with the right people. One of the key relationships that would shape his future came in the form of Meyer Lansky, a young Jewish gangster who was as brilliant with money as Luciano was with power. Lansky's expertise in finance, particularly in money laundering and gambling operations, was exactly what Luciano needed to take his operations to the next level. The partnership between Luciano and Lansky was the beginning of a powerful alliance that would reshape the criminal landscape in America. Lansky's business acumen complemented Luciano's ruthless ambition, and together, they began to build a network of criminal operations that spanned beyond New York City. They were able to bring organization and sophistication to the mafia, turning it from a series of disconnected street-level rackets into a multifaceted, nationwide business empire. While Luciano handled the strategic aspects, building alliances, eliminating rivals, and ensuring the loyalty of his partners, Lansky took charge of the financial operations, managing the money and ensuring that the mafia's profits flowed smoothly through a variety of channels. This partnership marked the beginning of Luciano's transformation from a street thug into a master strategist. He wasn't simply interested in running a small-time racket. He was focused on creating something that could last. Luciano's rise wasn't a result of brute force alone. It was a calculated effort to position himself as the mastermind behind a new kind of mafia, one that was organized, efficient, and highly profitable. It was in these formative years, as he was building alliances and establishing his reputation, that he began to truly understand the value of psychological manipulation in the world of organized crime. Luciano's ability to read people, to understand their motivations and desires, was a crucial element of his success. He knew that loyalty could be bought, but it had to be maintained. He knew how to use fear to control his allies and keep them in line. At the same time, he recognized that loyalty was just as valuable as fear in maintaining a solid base of support. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to balance both. He knew that if he could make men feel like they owed him their loyalty, whether through financial incentives, personal favors, or the sheer power he wielded, they would follow him without question. As Luciano built his empire, he began to make strategic moves that solidified his position. He didn't simply work his way up the ranks through violence and intimidation, though there was certainly plenty of that, but he also used his intelligence and cunning to eliminate rivals and secure his dominance. He made sure to eliminate any potential threats to his power, using psychological tactics to undermine his enemies before striking. Luciano was always thinking several steps ahead, anticipating the moves of his rivals and staying one step ahead of them. It wasn't long before Luciano's ambition began to take shape in a more concrete way. He realized that to truly control the mafia, he would need to centralize the power structure. The fragmented nature of the mafia, with each family operating independently, was inefficient and in many ways self-destructive. Luciano saw the potential for a more organized, unified system, one where the various families could cooperate under a single leadership, pooling their resources and working together for mutual benefit. But this would require more than just force. It would require a delicate balancing act of power, trust, and manipulation. As Luciano began to consolidate his power, he carefully navigated the complexities of mafia politics. He knew that every decision he made could have far-reaching consequences, and he approached each one with the careful precision of a chess player. His rise wasn't just a product of his ruthlessness, it was the result of a carefully crafted strategy to position himself as the leader of a unified, powerful criminal empire. He understood that power was not just about having the most men or the most territory, it was about controlling the flow of money, maintaining loyalty, and ensuring that no one could ever rise to challenge him. By the time Luciano had established himself as one of the most powerful figures in the mafia, he had built a criminal empire that was as sophisticated as any legitimate business. His ability to build relationships, eliminate threats, and make strategic decisions had allowed him to rise to the top. But his journey was far from over. Luciano's ambitions had only begun, and the next phase of his plan would take him from being just another mobster to the mastermind behind the largest criminal enterprise the world had ever seen. Luciano's ascent was not only about building power, it was about transforming the mafia into an empire. The streets of New York, filled with chaos and fractured allegiances, were no longer enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted to create a criminal syndicate that operated like a corporation, with an intricate network of professionals working together seamlessly to generate massive profits. The mafia, in his vision, was not a loose collection of families but a highly organized, disciplined, and profitable business. For this, Luciano would need to break away from the chaotic, violence-driven nature of the street-level mafia and introduce a new corporate-style structure that focused on efficiency, long-term strategy, and cooperation rather than the erratic nature of turf wars and petty rivalries. To turn the mafia into a legitimate business operation, Luciano needed to change the way it functioned. Instead of individual families and their bosses working independently, he aimed to create a unified, collaborative force where each family was an integral part of the larger whole. He sought to replace the old, disorganized ways with a top-down structure that mirrored that of legitimate businesses, a clear hierarchy where each level had its responsibilities and could rely on the other parts of the operation to be successful. This wasn't just about power. It was about creating a system that could operate smoothly, even in the face of law enforcement scrutiny, by being too large and interconnected to break down easily. Luciano's first major step toward this goal was eliminating the existing fragmentation within the mafia. At the time, each mafia family, led by a boss, operated almost like an independent fiefdom, with minimal coordination between them. Rivalries were constant, and each family's focus was on expanding its own influence. Luciano understood that if the mafia was to become a true criminal empire, the infighting and disarray had to stop. There could be no more small-time infighting or petty territorial disputes. Instead, every family had to work together as part of a greater whole. He realized that in order to achieve this, he would need to restructure the very framework of the mafia. His solution was the creation of a national crime syndicate, a centralized organization that would unify the mafia families under one umbrella. This move would not only eliminate the turf wars between the families but also provide the infrastructure for greater profits and long-term stability. The syndicate would function much like a corporation, with Luciano at the top as the CEO, overseeing operations and ensuring that the families collaborated on all major ventures. The families would still retain some autonomy, but the main goal was to create a system of shared resources, where cooperation rather than competition drove success. The idea of the National Crime Syndicate was revolutionary, a bold and ambitious step that would fundamentally change the nature of organized crime in America. Luciano understood that for such a vast network to function effectively, loyalty would be essential, but so would trust. Each family's involvement in the syndicate would be a calculated decision, and Luciano knew that he could use his position as the central figure to foster that loyalty. This wasn't about coercion or brute force, it was about providing something that was much more valuable, the promise of shared success. By uniting the families, Luciano created a situation where every boss and their crew had a stake in the syndicate's success. Each family's business interests would be protected, and their loyalty secured through the distribution of profits and the assurance that no one family would dominate another. At the heart of this new structure was Luciano's ability to balance power and fear with diplomacy and strategy. Unlike many of the other mafia bosses who often relied solely on violence to enforce their rule, Luciano understood the value of diplomacy. He knew that his power wasn't just about controlling territory or eliminating rivals, it was about controlling the flow of money. In the world of organized crime, money was everything, and Luciano had the vision to turn it into a well-oiled machine. Under his leadership, the various families would be able to work together to manage different illegal enterprises, from gambling and bootlegging to extortion and labor racketeering, all of which could now be run in a more organized and profitable manner. Luciano's partnership with Meyer Lansky was crucial in making this vision a reality. Lansky, who had a brilliant mind for finance and operations, helped Luciano put together the financial infrastructure that would support this new criminal empire. While Luciano was the face of the operation, the strategic mastermind behind its growth, Lansky handled the intricacies of money laundering, managing cash flow, and ensuring that the syndicate's operations were always funded. Together they made the mafia a true business. A business that operated smoothly, with a constant flow of money and resources from every corner of the United States. This wasn't just about creating a more organized crime syndicate, it was about building something sustainable. Luciano realized that for the mafia to continue thriving in the face of increasing law enforcement pressure, it had to adapt. The days of small-time rackets and street-level operations were over. The future lay in large-scale, nationwide operations that could survive under intense scrutiny. This required a level of sophistication and planning that had never been seen before in the mafia. Luciano and his partners began to invest in legitimate businesses that could be used as fronts for their illegal activities. They took control of everything from hotels to docks, ensuring that the syndicate's operations were deeply embedded in the legitimate economy. This allowed them to launder money more efficiently and avoid detection by law enforcement. One of Luciano's most innovative moves was his focus on labor unions. He understood that labor unions were a gateway to immense profits, and by controlling the unions, the syndicate could have its hands in virtually every major industry in the country. With Lansky's expertise in finance and Luciano's ability to manage relationships, they were able to infiltrate the unions and use them as a tool for expanding their empire. By the time Luciano's empire was in full swing, he had control over an enormous range of industries, from construction and transportation to casinos and illegal gambling operations. He had effectively turned the mafia into a multifaceted, nationwide operation that was deeply integrated into the fabric of American society. But Luciano's rise wasn't just about expanding the mafia's reach, it was about making sure the entire structure was impenetrable. He knew that, for the syndicate to function, it had to be more than just a group of families working together, it had to be an airtight operation where everyone knew their role and adhered to a strict hierarchy. Each family within the syndicate had its own designated area of influence, but they all operated under Luciano's authority. Luciano was a master of maintaining control while allowing for a certain degree of autonomy within the families. He understood that loyalty was vital, but so was the ability to allow his subordinates some leeway in running their own operations. Through careful management of these alliances, Luciano ensured that no one would ever be in a position to challenge him. He kept the peace within the syndicate, using a mixture of carrots and sticks to ensure that everyone adhered to the rules. Those who were loyal were rewarded handsomely, while those who betrayed the organization faced swift retribution. Luciano's power was both absolute and elusive. He was not just a mafia boss, he was a strategist, a businessman, and a leader who had found a way to make organized crime a global enterprise. Luciano's ability to turn the mafia into a well-oiled machine, rather than just a loose collection of individual families, marked the beginning of a new era for organized crime. His innovations reshaped the criminal underworld, transforming it into a business empire that operated with precision and efficiency. His genius lay not in his ability to use violence, but in his ability to turn the mafia into something far more powerful. A network of loyal, profitable operations that spanned the country and reached into every major industry. What Luciano had created wasn't just a criminal empire, it was the blueprint for modern organized crime, one that would endure long after his reign. At the core of Luciano's rise to power was his understanding of the mafia's greatest asset, and its greatest weakness, loyalty. The mafia's infamous code of silence, omerta, was more than just a rule, it was the very foundation upon which the mafia's authority was built. It demanded unwavering loyalty and obedience from its members, with the harshest consequences for those who broke the code. But while omerta was a tool for maintaining power, it also represented a paradox for the mafia. Loyalty could bind people together, but it could also create tension, suspicion, and betrayal. Luciano understood that loyalty was not simply about following orders. It was a complex web of fear, respect, and self-interest. Luciano's approach to loyalty was revolutionary. He wasn't interested in enforcing loyalty through blind obedience or brute force. He understood that loyalty had to be earned, not demanded. It had to be a relationship that worked both ways. For Luciano, loyalty was a currency that could be traded, but it was also fragile. His genius lay in his ability to manipulate this loyalty and turn it into a psychological tool that kept his empire intact. He created a system where loyalty was rewarded but betrayal was ruthlessly punished, making the cost of disloyalty far greater than the benefit of defection. To enforce this code, Luciano did not rely solely on fear or violence, though those elements were, of course, part of the equation. He understood that fear was a powerful motivator, but loyalty could not survive on fear alone. If loyalty was built purely on the threat of violence, it would always be unstable. Instead, Luciano crafted a delicate balance. He rewarded loyalty with power, money, and influence, creating a system where those who were faithful to him reaped the benefits. But he also created a climate of fear where betrayal was never tolerated. Those who broke the code, whether through greed, personal ambition, or the desire for power, faced swift retribution. The fear of the consequences of betrayal was enough to keep many in line, but the promise of wealth and security was the driving force behind most of his followers' loyalty. This complex relationship between loyalty and fear was reflected in every aspect of Luciano's operations. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was a master of psychological manipulation. He understood the human psyche, how to play on people's desires, insecurities, and ambitions. In the world of the mafia, loyalty was not a simple matter of allegiance to one's family or boss. It was about survival, about securing one's place in the mafia hierarchy and ensuring that betrayal did not come with consequences. Luciano knew how to make people feel like they had no other choice but to stay loyal. If they weren't loyal to him, they would be left exposed, vulnerable to rivals and enemies. He didn't just control the men who worked for him. He controlled their fate. Luciano's manipulation of loyalty extended beyond the individual level. He used it to shape the very structure of the mafia itself. By creating alliances, making deals, and distributing power, Luciano ensured that his empire operated as a unified front, with each boss, capo regime, and soldier working for the collective good of the syndicate. Loyalty was not just a matter of personal allegiance to Luciano but also a loyalty to the larger organization that he had built. He had created a system where loyalty to the syndicate was as important as loyalty to any one family or boss. This sense of collective loyalty made the mafia stronger, more resilient, and more difficult to destroy. It turned what had once been a fragmented, often dysfunctional underworld into a cohesive and powerful criminal empire. At the same time, Luciano's understanding of loyalty wasn't limited to his immediate subordinates. He knew that the success of the mafia required a delicate balance between maintaining internal order and managing external relationships. One of the most critical aspects of Luciano's leadership was his ability to forge alliances with other mafia families, as well as with influential figures outside of the criminal world. He wasn't just making friends, he was strategically positioning himself as the undisputed leader of a powerful, nationwide network of criminal enterprises. In doing so, he solidified his position and further ensured the loyalty of those who depended on him for power and security. Luciano's alliances were often built on mutual interests, shared goals, and, of course, loyalty. He understood that loyalty in the mafia was transactional. While the mafia was based on respect, it was also driven by self-interest. Every ally had something to gain, and every deal was an exchange. Luciano capitalized on this dynamic by positioning himself as the centerpiece of the syndicate. He was the one who could make deals, broker alliances, and ensure that everyone had a stake in the success of the operation. In return for their loyalty, Luciano offered power and resources, access to the wealth generated by the syndicate's far-reaching criminal enterprises. But even as he manipulated loyalty to his advantage, Luciano knew that loyalty was not something to be taken for granted. It had to be nurtured and carefully managed. The mafia, like any organization, was constantly in danger of splintering. Rivalries, personal ambitions, and betrayal were always lurking beneath the surface. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to recognize these potential threats and neutralize them before they could destroy the delicate balance he had created. He was a master at identifying the weak points in his organization, the men who might pose a threat to his authority, and the situations that could lead to conflict. He knew that, in the mafia, the most dangerous thing was not an enemy on the outside, it was a traitor on the inside. This understanding of loyalty also informed Luciano's approach to the infamous wars within the mafia, those violent, high-stakes battles for control of territory and power. Luciano, however, took a different approach to these conflicts. Instead of waging all-out war against his rivals, he often preferred to use diplomacy and strategic negotiation to resolve conflicts. He knew that violent confrontations could destabilize the organization and jeopardize the profits they were all working toward. Rather than engaging in open warfare, Luciano would often broker deals between warring factions, using his influence to create peace where others might have opted for bloodshed. By doing so, he maintained the stability of his empire while consolidating more power in the process. But there were times when loyalty was tested to its limits. Luciano's ruthlessness in dealing with traitors became a hallmark of his leadership. In one of his most infamous moves, he orchestrated the execution of his former mentor Joe the Boss Masuria, in a bold power grab that would cement his control over the Genovese family and the entire mafia in New York. Masuria had once been a close ally of Luciano's, but when their interests diverged and Masuria's grip on power weakened, Luciano saw an opportunity to take control. By eliminating Masuria, Luciano sent a clear message to everyone in the mafia. Loyalty was paramount, but it had to be mutual. Those who could no longer serve him or who posed a threat to his reign would be eliminated without hesitation. Luciano's strategic manipulation of loyalty allowed him to rise above the petty infighting and territorial squabbles that had plagued the mafia for decades. His vision of a unified, organized criminal syndicate was realized not just through sheer force, but through his ability to manage loyalty as both a weapon and a shield. By understanding the complex psychological dynamics of loyalty, how it could be earned, maintained, and used to his advantage, Luciano was able to create an empire that was both powerful and resilient. He had mastered the art of loyalty in the mafia, and in doing so, he had become its undisputed leader, reshaping the criminal landscape in ways that no one had ever imagined. Luciano's ambition, however, was never just about organizing the mafia. It was about turning crime into a highly efficient business, one that could rival legitimate enterprises. For him, the business of crime wasn't limited to street-level hustles and petty rackets. It was about taking control of large-scale, lucrative operations that generated wealth far beyond the typical scope of criminal activities. His genius lay in his ability to see the mafia not as a network of isolated criminal families, but as a massive enterprise capable of creating an intricate web of profitable, diversified operations. Under his leadership, the mafia would transform from a chaotic, fragmented syndicate into an organized, nationwide business empire. One of Luciano's most innovative moves was the way he approached the concept of organized crime itself. Instead of relying solely on the traditional mafia activities of bootlegging, gambling, and extortion, he expanded into entirely new territories. Luciano understood that in order to create a truly profitable criminal enterprise, he had to diversify. Just as any successful business would branch out into various sectors, The mafia needed to expand into multiple forms of illegal activity to ensure its long-term stability. Luciano's vision was simple: control everything. From gambling to smuggling, labor unions to construction, he sought to monopolize industries, or at the very least, ensure that the mafia had a significant stake in each one. By doing so, he not only created a vast network of criminal operations but also built the mafia into an economic powerhouse that could survive and thrive even under intense scrutiny from law enforcement. This wasn't just about making money on a small scale. This was about ensuring the mafia could operate like a business, making millions, if not billions, each year through a variety of interlinked activities. One of the first areas Luciano targeted was the world of gambling. At the time, gambling was already a significant part of the mafia's operations, but Luciano sought to elevate it. He understood the potential for massive profit in both legal and illegal gambling, but he also saw the instability that came with disorganized gambling rings. Luciano recognized that for gambling to become a reliable, long-term source of income for the mafia, it needed to be regulated and centralized. He sought to eliminate the chaotic, street-level bookmaking operations that were so prevalent at the time and replace them with a more systematic, organized approach. He established a network of casinos, racetracks, and other gambling enterprises, ensuring that every part of the operation was under his control. This was no longer a handful of local rackets. It was a multi-million-dollar industry with Luciano at the helm. But gambling was only one part of his empire. Luciano's interests also extended into smuggling and bootlegging, industries that had already made significant money during Prohibition. While many mafia families continued to rely on traditional forms of bootlegging, Luciano was thinking even bigger. He created a vast smuggling network that not only imported alcohol but also moved drugs, weapons, and even people across state lines. The sheer scale of his operations made the mafia nearly impossible to dismantle, and his influence extended far beyond the confines of New York. With his newfound power, Luciano was able to control the flow of illegal goods across the United States, securing deals with criminal organizations in other countries, including Canada, Cuba, and even Europe. However, Luciano's brilliance wasn't limited to the traditional criminal rackets. One of the most significant areas of expansion came in the form of labor unions. At first glance, labor unions might not seem like a natural fit for organized crime. But Luciano saw an opportunity where others saw only potential conflict. The unions at the time were powerful political forces that controlled large sectors of the workforce, from dock workers to construction crews. These unions were ripe for exploitation, and Luciano knew that by infiltrating them, he could access a virtually limitless source of power and profit. By using his influence and the power of the syndicate, Luciano was able to place his men in key positions within the labor unions, making them entirely subservient to the mafia. From there, the mafia could control industries that were crucial to the functioning of the American economy. Whether it was construction, transportation, or docks, Luciano's men were at the helm, controlling the flow of goods, labor, and money. This move not only gave the mafia a stranglehold on key industries but also provided an unprecedented level of protection. By controlling labor, Luciano ensured that no one could operate in these industries without paying the mafia's tax, a toll that was often hefty and always necessary for doing business. The power that came with controlling labor unions also provided Luciano with a shield against law enforcement. As the mafia's influence over unions grew, so did its ability to manipulate political systems. Luciano understood that in order to protect his empire, he needed more than just muscle. He needed connections within the government, law enforcement, and the political world. By controlling labor unions, Luciano was able to forge alliances with influential politicians, judges, and law enforcement officers. He used the unions as bargaining chips, ensuring that his men were untouchable by the law. He also used these connections to get favorable treatment from politicians, which allowed him to further expand his empire without fear of interference from the government. Luciano's understanding of the importance of logistics and infrastructure set him apart from his contemporaries. While other mobsters were focused on expanding their turf and engaging in direct violence, Luciano was thinking about the bigger picture. He knew that the key to the mafia's long-term success was in its ability to operate smoothly, with minimal friction and maximum profit. This was a vision of organized crime that went beyond the simple theft and violence that had characterized the mafia in its earlier years. Luciano was building an empire that could endure, one that could rival any legitimate corporation in terms of size, scope, and profitability. He also expanded into legitimate business ventures, which served as both a way to launder money and as a means of securing more power. Casinos, restaurants, and hotels became key parts of his empire. These businesses not only allowed him to wash illegal earnings but also provided a means of integrating his criminal activities into the broader economy. They became fronts for money laundering and places to hide the flow of illicit funds. For Luciano, legitimate businesses weren't just about avoiding the law, they were an essential part of the criminal enterprise, allowing him to build a network of operations that could withstand scrutiny and survive even the most aggressive law enforcement tactics. What set Luciano apart from his contemporaries was his ability to think like a businessman. He was a visionary who saw organized crime not as a collection of isolated rackets but as a sprawling, multifaceted business empire. He didn't just rely on brute force or terror. He relied on his ability to think strategically, to make calculated decisions, and to expand his operations in ways that no one had ever imagined. He created a complex web of interconnected industries, from smuggling and gambling to labor unions and legitimate businesses, all working together to create a seamless and incredibly profitable operation. By the time Luciano's empire reached its peak, it had become an unstoppable force. He had transcended the world of street crime and transformed the mafia into something far more powerful. It was no longer just about running rackets, it was about controlling entire industries, manipulating labor, and operating in a global network of criminal enterprises. Luciano had created a business empire built on fear, loyalty, and clever strategy, and it would remain the blueprint for modern organized crime for decades to come. Luciano's empire wasn't built on only the power of his own family, nor was it limited to his control over the mafia's rackets. His influence reached far beyond the criminal world, threading its way into the lives of politicians, law enforcement officials, and influential business leaders. This ability to weave his criminal endeavors into the fabric of American society, while staying just out of reach of the law, became a key element of his dominance. But with such power came enemies, and even within his own network, rivalry simmered beneath the surface, each potential ally harboring ambitions of their own. In the world of organized crime, alliances could be as fragile as they were vital. The mafia by its very nature was a system that ran on trust, but trust, in this world, was as conditional as it was fleeting. Betrayal was always a possibility, and even the most solid alliances could be torn apart by greed, ambition, or the simple hunger for more power. Luciano's mastery of this dangerous game of loyalty and betrayal would ultimately become both his greatest asset and his most potent vulnerability. Among the most significant challenges to his authority was the rising tension between the mafia's older generation and the new wave of ambitious, younger mobsters. While Luciano had worked hard to dismantle the old power structures and create a more unified and business-oriented mafia, not all of the older bosses were on board with his vision. There were those who still believed in the traditional ways of running the mafia, a world driven by violence, loyalty, and personal fiefdoms. These men, who had built their fortunes on the old system, saw Luciano's rise not as a promise of progress, but as a threat to their way of life. They didn't trust the idea of a more organized, corporate-style mafia. To them, it was too much like the kind of world they had spent their lives fighting against, a world where their power was diluted by the need for cooperation. These generational conflicts were compounded by the rising ambitions within the ranks of Luciano's own family. As his empire expanded, so too did the number of men who sought a piece of the power and wealth that Luciano controlled. It was a well-known fact in the mafia world that power wasn't just about territory or wealth, it was about influence. Luciano knew this better than anyone. He understood that, in the criminal underworld, the most dangerous thing wasn't an enemy from the outside, it was a loyal ally who might turn against you when you least expected it. One of Luciano's most significant challenges came in the form of Joe, the boss Masuria, a powerful figure in the Genovese family who had initially been a mentor and ally to Luciano. However, as Luciano's power grew, Masuria's influence began to wane. Luciano had begun to outgrow Masuria's methods, preferring a more calculated, organized approach to crime. Masuria, on the other hand, still clung to the old ways, ruthless and aggressive, seeing loyalty and respect as things that could only be earned through violence and intimidation. Their differences eventually came to a head. In the early 1930s, Luciano made the decision to eliminate Masuria in a calculated and ruthless move that would cement his control over the mafia. In one of the most infamous power plays in mafia history, Luciano orchestrated the murder of Masuria, signaling that there would be no room for old-school thinking in his new vision for the mafia. But Masuria's death, while crucial in consolidating Luciano's power, also sent shockwaves through the criminal world. It was a move that solidified his reputation as a man who was not only willing to kill for power but also a man who understood the subtle dynamics of mafia politics. His ability to eliminate a mentor, someone he had once looked up to, proved that loyalty was a currency in Luciano's world, but it could be discarded just as easily when it no longer served his interests. Misuria's death set off a chain reaction, and Luciano found himself at the center of a power struggle within the mafia. As he continued to expand his influence and control, rival factions within the crime syndicates began to emerge. There were men who wanted to challenge his authority, people who felt that they deserved a greater share of the power Luciano had accumulated. In particular, Salvatore Maranzano, a powerful boss in his own right, became one of Luciano's greatest rivals. Maranzano, much like Misuria, represented the old guard, someone who still clung to the old ways of running the mafia. To him, Luciano's reforms were a threat to his traditional power base. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most notorious conflicts in mafia history, the so-called Castellamarese War. For over a year, Luciano's faction clashed violently with Maranzano's, resulting in numerous deaths and betrayals on both sides. At the heart of this war was the question of who would control the future of the mafia. Luciano knew that in order to succeed, he needed to eliminate Maranzano and those who still adhered to the old ways. By now, Luciano had built a loyal following, and he knew that he could count on his men to stand by him during this crucial battle for control. In the end, Luciano's strategy won out. Maranzano, like Misuria before him, was killed, and Luciano's victory marked the beginning of a new era for the mafia. With Maranzano's death, Luciano became the undisputed leader of the mafia, consolidating power and bringing about an unprecedented level of cooperation between mafia families. The victory also cemented his position as the architect of the new mafia, a man who had succeeded in eliminating both rivals and traditions that no longer served his vision. But the power struggles didn't end with Maranzano's death. In fact, the murder of such powerful figures only drew more attention to Luciano and the way he operated. Even though he was now at the top of the mafia, there were still those who sought to challenge him, both inside and outside the organization. Luciano's mastery of loyalty and fear, however, ensured that no one could threaten his reign for long. His ability to manage relationships, navigate the shifting alliances of the mafia, and execute his will with deadly precision made him an almost untouchable figure. Outside the mafia, law enforcement and political figures continued to be a constant source of tension. Luciano had managed to build powerful alliances within the political establishment, using his influence to protect his interests, but the heat was beginning to rise. The government, frustrated by its inability to break the power of the mafia, began to put increasing pressure on Luciano and his associates. His empire had grown too large, and the eyes of the law were now firmly trained on him. Despite the mounting pressure, Luciano continued to operate with near-total impunity. He was a master of deflection, always managing to stay one step ahead of the authorities. He understood the importance of keeping his hands clean, of never getting directly involved in the messy details of his operations. Instead, Luciano relied on intermediaries, making sure that those who worked for him took the fall when things went wrong. It was a system that worked for him, for a while. But eventually the authorities would catch up. The eventual fall of Luciano came not because of any major strategic error, but because of his growing entanglements with law enforcement and the government. The sheer scale of his operations, combined with his ability to manipulate both the mafia and the political world, made him a target. Luciano's downfall would come not through betrayal from within the mafia, though that was always a possibility, but from the external pressures that had been building for years. His empire, built on loyalty, fear, and ruthless strategy, was about to come under siege in a way that even he could not foresee. The paradox of Luciano's rise, his mastery over both the mafia and the political world, was also the reason for his eventual demise. The more power he amassed, the more enemies he made, and the more impossible it became to maintain his control over both sides of the coin. As Luciano's empire expanded and the conflict between the families reached a boiling point, his position began to face mounting pressure from all sides. The competition within the mafia, the rivalry between powerful figures, and the increasing interest from law enforcement created an environment where survival was no longer a given. It became a daily game of chess, with every move potentially leading to betrayal, conflict, or even death. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, Luciano's brilliance as a strategist allowed him to navigate through the most dangerous of times, leveraging his influence and cunning to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining his control. The mafia's internal struggles during this period were reflective of a larger power struggle that involved more than just turf wars and street-level violence. These conflicts were about control over the future of organized crime in America. Who would shape the future of the mafia and who would dominate the criminal underworld? For Luciano, the stakes had grown far higher than simply surviving in the streets of New York. He had built something far more intricate and far-reaching. A vast criminal empire with international influence, spanning across industries and operating in nearly every corner of American society. But as the scope of Luciano's operations grew, so did the scrutiny of law enforcement. The authorities, long aware of the mafia's hold over significant parts of the economy, were now turning their attention toward its leader, Lucky Luciano. The U.S. government, particularly the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), had been working relentlessly to dismantle organized crime for years. However, the nature of Luciano's operations made him incredibly difficult to target. He wasn't just a mob boss in the traditional sense, he was a businessman with ties to legitimate industries, a man whose empire was so vast that it became almost impossible to separate his criminal enterprises from the legitimate economy. But no empire, no matter how carefully constructed, can remain invulnerable forever. Luciano's downfall began with an investigation that focused on his influence in both the criminal world and legitimate businesses. His careful manipulation of labor unions, his involvement in smuggling, gambling, and drug trafficking, and his connections to various international criminal syndicates all made him a significant target for the law. In the end, it wasn't a rival mobster or a traitor within his ranks that would bring him down, it was the relentless pressure from the government, which had been gathering evidence against him for years. The final blow came when Luciano was arrested in 1936, on charges of compulsory prostitution and operating a massive vice operation. It was an offense that would lead to his conviction and a 30 to 50-year prison sentence, marking the beginning of the end of his reign over the mafia. But Luciano's arrest wasn't the result of an isolated criminal act. It was the culmination of years of investigation, political pressure, and strategic moves by law enforcement to finally neutralize the man who had become the face of organized crime in America. Yet even while behind bars, Luciano's influence did not diminish. His criminal empire was not built on the strength of one individual, but on an intricate network of trusted associates and allies who continued to run the operations in his absence. Luciano's leadership style had been one of delegation and strategic management. He had empowered his lieutenants to run operations while maintaining ultimate authority over the larger structure. In this sense, his arrest did not result in the immediate collapse of his empire. Instead, Luciano maintained his power from prison, continuing to make crucial decisions and maintain a hold over his operations. What became clear during his incarceration was that Luciano was far more than just a mafia boss. He was a symbol of the new organized crime syndicate that had taken root in America. He had created a system that could endure without him, a system that operated on loyalty, strategic alliances, and financial interests rather than brute force. His ability to orchestrate criminal operations from prison demonstrated the resilience and sophistication of the empire he had built. Even in a confined cell, Luciano's reach extended far beyond the prison walls. However, the political pressure on Luciano remained unrelenting. The government, determined to make an example of him, had no intention of allowing him to maintain control over his empire from behind bars. In 1946, after serving more than a decade in prison, Luciano was deported to Italy. The United States had essentially exiled him, stripping him of his citizenship and sending him back to a country that had long since moved on from its own organized crime culture. For Luciano, this exile represented not just the loss of his power within the American underworld, but also a loss of the life he had built. The mafia in America had given him a sense of identity and purpose. He was not just a criminal but a master strategist, a leader who had reshaped an entire industry. To be exiled to Italy with no resources and no contacts in a foreign land was a significant blow to his ego. Yet even in exile, Luciano was far from powerless. He tried to regain influence in Europe, particularly through his connections with Sicilian mafia families. But the world he had once dominated was no longer the same. The war, the rise of new criminal organizations, and changing political realities made it increasingly difficult for him to exercise the kind of control he had once wielded in the United States. Luciano's life in exile was filled with frustration and a sense of disillusionment. He struggled to re-establish the dominance he had once enjoyed in America. The glory days of his empire seemed like a distant memory, and the power he had once controlled so effortlessly had slipped through his fingers. Yet even in these final years, Luciano's legacy remained intact. His influence over the mafia, though diminished, still loomed large in the world of organized crime. He had pioneered the concept of organized crime as a business, turning the mafia into a multi-million-dollar industry, and his tactics would serve as the blueprint for future generations of mobsters. The irony of Luciano's life was that while he had built a criminal empire based on fear and loyalty, his own downfall was a result of the very forces he had so skillfully managed: politics, law enforcement, and the shifting tides of power within the criminal underworld. His strategic genius had made him invulnerable for many years, but in the end, it was the broader societal forces beyond his control, that brought him down. Luciano's exile to Italy marked the final chapter of his involvement in organized crime. The mafia in America would continue to thrive in the decades that followed, but it would never be the same without him. He had been the figurehead of a new era in organized crime, and his absence was felt across the entire syndicate. As the years passed, the world of the mafia evolved, new leaders rose to power, and Luciano's name became the stuff of legend. Yet, his story remained a testament to the ability of one man to reshape an entire criminal industry, and to the reality that, in the end, even the most powerful of men can be brought low by forces outside their control. His final years were marked by the quiet recognition that, despite his fall from grace, Luciano had achieved something few others could ever dream of. He had changed the very structure of organized crime in America. His innovations, his methods, and his leadership would leave an indelible mark on the mafia for decades to come. Even in exile, Luciano's legacy continued to influence the world of crime, ensuring that his name would remain synonymous with power, strategy, and the rise of the modern mafia. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't a swift collapse but a gradual unraveling of the empire he had so carefully built over the years. His arrest, conviction, and subsequent imprisonment were just the beginning of a much larger struggle, a battle for control over the sprawling criminal network that had once been a cohesive, well-oiled machine. The void left by Luciano's absence from the streets of New York and the leadership of the mafia was a vacuum that invited infighting, power struggles, and shifting allegiances. It wasn't just about a criminal kingpin being taken off the streets, it was about the disintegration of the delicate balance he had created, the delicate alliances and systems that had made the mafia so formidable under his rule. Luciano's absence would trigger a series of events that would redefine the mafia in the years to come. While Luciano remained behind bars, the crime families he had unified began to splinter, and new factions formed in the wake of his disappearance. The power vacuum that ensued wasn't just a challenge for the remaining mob bosses, it was an opportunity for new, ambitious players to rise up and seize power. But without the unifying influence of Luciano, the mafia would slowly begin to fragment, and those who once flourished under his rule would be left to fend for themselves, making deals, betraying old friends, and even resorting to violence to maintain their own empires. As Luciano's trial began in the 1930s, his once formidable support network within the mafia started to falter. The men who had been his closest allies and most trusted lieutenants, like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and others, had to quickly decide how to position themselves in a world where Luciano's influence was no longer as dominant. Those who had supported him in the past now had to consider their future, both within the mafia and in the broader criminal landscape. Costello, for example, saw his opportunity to expand his influence by forming his own alliances with other mobsters who were eager to step into the void left by Luciano. Costello had long been a loyal associate of Luciano, but with Luciano behind bars and the family structure crumbling, he began to navigate the mafia landscape as an independent power player. His moves were calculated, knowing that the mafia's future would no longer be shaped by one strong hand at the top, but by a complex web of factions, each seeking to carve out their own piece of the criminal pie. Costello was no fool. He knew that Luciano's methods had been brilliant in their simplicity and efficiency, but now, in the aftermath of Luciano's downfall, it was every boss for himself. The rise of Costello and others like him, who had previously been content to work under Luciano's leadership, signaled the beginning of a new era in the mafia. With Luciano locked away, these men now had the freedom to expand their own operations, to make their own decisions, and to carve out their own territories. But the fragmentation that followed Luciano's arrest was not just a matter of internal power struggles. It also meant that the mafia was now vulnerable to external pressures that it had once been able to resist. The authorities, sensing an opportunity to strike at the heart of the mafia while it was still reeling from the loss of its leader, began to intensify their efforts. With Luciano's imprisonment and the weakening of the mafia's internal structure, law enforcement ramped up its investigations, making use of wiretaps, informants, and undercover agents to infiltrate the criminal syndicate. At the same time, the political climate in the United States was shifting. The public had grown increasingly aware of the power and reach of the mafia, and there was a growing demand for the government to take action against organized crime. The mafia, once seemingly untouchable, was now under siege. However, despite the mounting pressure, Luciano's network didn't crumble immediately. Even though he was behind bars, he had set up a system that allowed his lieutenants to continue running the day-to-day operations. These men, loyal to him and willing to keep his legacy intact, worked tirelessly to ensure that the money kept flowing, and that the mafia's vast web of criminal enterprises remained operational. The connections Luciano had made, both inside and outside the mafia, kept his influence alive. His understanding of power and loyalty had created a structure that allowed the mafia to continue, even in his absence. But Luciano's absence also made his former allies vulnerable. The very system of loyalty and fear he had so carefully cultivated began to unravel. Without his steady hand at the helm, old alliances were tested, and power struggles that had been brewing beneath the surface began to erupt. The peace that Luciano had brokered between the various mafia families now began to fray. Disagreements over territory, control, and resources ignited, and it wasn't long before the streets were once again filled with violence. The mafia's once stable hierarchy had been shaken to its core. Frank Costello, who had once been the face of Luciano's interest in the gambling rackets, now found himself at odds with Vito Genovese, a former ally and rival for power within the organization. Genovese, a man with his own ambitions, began to challenge Costello for control, seeking to carve out his own territory. Genovese's rise wasn't a spontaneous one. He had been laying the groundwork for years, working behind the scenes to position himself as the natural successor to Luciano's throne. The fight between Costello and Genovese escalated quickly, culminating in a violent power struggle that would set the tone for the next decade of mafia infighting. Despite these challenges, the mafia in the years after Luciano's imprisonment was still a formidable force. The organization had a deep reservoir of wealth, influence, and connections. It had established a powerful infrastructure across the United States and beyond, with tentacles stretching into numerous legitimate industries. Luciano's business acumen had ensured that the mafia was not just a collection of criminals, it was a far-reaching syndicate with deep roots in both the criminal and business worlds. As the fight for control continued, this network of power and resources allowed the mafia to survive, even if it was no longer the monolithic force it had once been. The years after Luciano's arrest and imprisonment were marked by a sense of uncertainty. The mafia's future was uncertain, and the question of who would lead the organization in Luciano's absence loomed large. Costello, Genovese, and others vied for dominance, each trying to position themselves as the rightful heir to Luciano's criminal empire. Yet, despite the infighting, the mafia would continue to operate, though in a much different form than the organization Luciano had once led. No longer unified under one leader, the families would now operate in a more fractured and decentralized manner. Despite the chaotic aftermath of his fall from power, Luciano's legacy remained intact. The lessons he had taught, the systems he had put in place, and the relationships he had forged endured long after his conviction. His vision for a united, business-oriented mafia had been realized, even if it was no longer under his direct control. His influence, though less visible, continued to shape the operations of the mafia for years to come. And even in prison, where he was physically removed from the world of crime, Luciano remained a looming figure. His name whispered in the halls of the mafia as the man who had changed the face of organized crime forever. While Luciano's direct involvement in the mafia would fade with time, his strategic approach, his understanding of loyalty and fear, and his ability to unify and organize the criminal underworld would continue to resonate in the hearts of those who sought power in the years to come. His legacy would become a blueprint for future generations of mobsters, a testament to his extraordinary vision and unparalleled ability to manipulate both people and systems. In the end, Luciano had shown the world that power, when properly managed, could endure far beyond the individual who wielded it. Luciano's trial in 1936 was a media frenzy, a spectacle that captivated the nation and sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The courtroom became the stage for one of the most significant moments in mafia history, a moment that would forever shape the public's perception of organized crime and solidify Luciano's place as one of the most influential mob figures in American history. But this trial wasn't just about criminal charges, it was about the very future of the mafia itself, a battle for control over an empire that Luciano had spent years building. The charges against Luciano were serious: running a massive prostitution ring and coercing young women into a life of sex work. It was a charge that would define his downfall and serve as the vehicle by which the government would finally dismantle his criminal operations. The case was meticulously constructed by authorities, leveraging testimonies from witnesses, wiretaps, and the power of law enforcement. But what made the trial even more dangerous for Luciano was the public's growing awareness of the mafia's reach and power. The trial was not just about proving a criminal act, it was about breaking down the very foundations of organized crime in America, and Luciano was at the center of it all. The courtroom was electric, with the media covering every moment of the trial, sensationalizing the details of his life and the sprawling criminal empire he had built. Journalists and photographers were eager to capture the moment of the so-called mafia kingpin finally being brought to justice. Luciano's name had become synonymous with the rise of organized crime, and the trial would only cement that association. His every move in court was watched with intense scrutiny. The fact that the government had managed to get Luciano into the courtroom, let alone secure a conviction, was seen as a monumental victory for law enforcement. But Luciano, as always, was prepared. Throughout the trial, he maintained an air of calm and composure. He wasn't rattled by the attention or the gravity of the situation. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent to the accusations. His demeanor was that of a man who had faced much worse and had always come out on top. In some ways, his calmness only added to the mystique that surrounded him. His ability to keep a level head, even in the face of such damning charges, was a testament to the confidence he had in his own power and his understanding of how the world worked. Despite his outward calm, the trial marked a pivotal turning point in Luciano's life and his influence over the mafia. It was the moment when the facade of invincibility that he had so carefully crafted started to crack. For the first time, the full weight of the law came down on him with the intention of dismantling everything he had worked for. His fate, now in the hands of the legal system, was uncertain. This wasn't just about personal survival, it was about the survival of the very empire he had created. In the end, the government was able to secure a conviction. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for his involvement in the prostitution ring, marking the beginning of the end of his reign over the mafia. The trial itself became a symbol of the growing determination of the U.S. government to take down organized crime. The conviction was a public victory, not just for the authorities, but for the people who had long been victimized by the mafia's reach. For many, it seemed like justice had finally been served. Yet, the reality was more complicated. Luciano's conviction, while a victory on paper, didn't actually eliminate his influence. In many ways, his time behind bars only made him more dangerous. From prison, Luciano continued to run his criminal empire, relying on intermediaries to handle the operations while he remained the guiding hand behind the scenes. His reach was vast, and his ability to pull the strings from a prison cell demonstrated the true depth of his power and the strength of the infrastructure he had built. He had created a system so intricate, so interconnected, that even incarceration couldn't stop it from functioning. As he sat behind bars, Luciano's legacy began to shift. The man who had once been the face of organized crime in America was now a symbol of both the triumph and the futility of the criminal justice system. While he was no longer physically able to control the streets, his ideas, his methods, and his leadership continued to shape the world of organized crime. The very methods that had allowed him to build his empire, his focus on loyalty, fear, and strategic alliances, continued to be the foundation of the mafia's operations. Even as the authorities celebrated their victory, they couldn't erase the fact that Luciano had successfully set up a structure that could survive without him. But his conviction also marked a profound shift in how the world viewed the mafia. No longer was it just an underground network of criminals. With Luciano's trial, it became a national concern, an issue that was impossible to ignore. The public's fascination with organized crime grew, as did the sense of fear and intrigue surrounding it. Luciano in many ways became a symbol of the mafia itself, a symbol of the power and corruption that could thrive in the shadows of society, always operating just out of reach of the law. In the years that followed, Luciano's name continued to echo through the halls of power. His trial, while a public spectacle, did not signal the end of the mafia's dominance in America. Far from it. The conviction only served to solidify Luciano's place in history as a criminal mastermind, a man who had transcended the boundaries of the law and turned the mafia into a global empire. His legacy would live on, influencing generations of criminals, mobsters, and leaders in the underworld who would adopt his strategies and techniques. For Luciano, the trial was a turning point, but it was not the end. His life behind bars would be marked by continued influence, by the ability to shape events from the shadows. The trial had not broken him. Instead, it had only deepened the myth surrounding his name. The power he had once held in the streets of New York had been taken from him physically, but in the world of organized crime, power was never truly about the individual. It was about the systems you put in place, the networks you built, and the alliances you forged. Luciano had created a criminal empire that was so deeply entrenched in American society that it couldn't be dismantled by one trial, one conviction, or even one life sentence. The real question after his conviction was whether the system he had created would survive without him at the helm. Would the mafia fall apart without its genius leader? Or would it adapt, evolve, and continue to thrive, finding new ways to operate even in the face of mounting pressure from law enforcement? As history would show, it was the latter. The mafia, like Luciano himself, was never truly gone. It just adapted, hiding in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to rise again.